Hello, my name is Sarah Codd, and for my Learning Theories presentation, I am doing it on classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, also known as Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, is learning through association and was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. In simple terms, two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response in a person or animal. In the early part of the 20th century, Pavlov was studying the digestive system of dogs when he noticed an interesting behavioral phenomenon. The dogs began to salivate when the lab technicians who normally fed them entered the room, even though the dogs had not yet received any food. Pavlov realized that the dogs were salivating because they knew that they were about to be fed. The dogs had begun to associate the arrival of the technicians with the food that soon followed their appearance in the room. With this team of researchers, Pavlov began studying this process in more detail. He conducted a series of experiments in which, over a number of trials, dogs were exposed to a sound immediately before receiving food. He systematically controlled the onset of the sound and the timing of the delivery of the food, and recorded the amount of the dog's salivation. Initially, the dogs salivated only when they saw or smelled the food, but after several pairings of the sound and the food, the dogs began to salivate as soon as they heard the sound. The animals had learned to associate the sound with the food that followed. Pavlov had identified this fundamental associative learning process. It refers to learning that occurs when a neutral stimulus, in this case the sound, becomes associated with a stimulus, in this case the food, that naturally produces a behavior. After the association is learned, the previously neutral stimulus is sufficient to produce the behavior. Psychologists use specific terms to identify the stimuli and the responses in the classical conditioning. The unconditional stimulus is something, in this case food, that triggers a naturally occurring response. And the unconditioned response is the naturally occurring response, which is the salivation that follows the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is a neutral stimulus that, after being repeatedly presented prior to the unconditioned stimulus, evokes a similar response as the unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's experiment, the sound of the tone served as the conditioned stimulus that, after learning, produced the conditioned response, which is the acquired response to the formerly neutral stimulus. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same behavior, in this case, salivation, but they are given different names because they are produced by different stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, respectively. Examples of this theory in action in the classroom, I have a few. For my first example, I have when the bell rings in a high school, students are conditioned to get up from their desks and leave the classroom and move to their next class. Both teacher and student know this signals passing time. Another example would be when working with a student in an autistic classroom using discrete trial training, a teacher uses a stimulus to reward and shape desired behavior. For example, if you would like a student to solve the problem 2 + 2, and he writes 4 on his whiteboard, you reinforce this response with a reward. The reward could be anything from food to a snack or a toy or free time. Therefore, when you ask the student to solve the next problem, they are more likely to elicit a correct response. For my final example, I have when a teacher would like a classroom to quiet their voices, she may use a signal, like flickering the lights on and off 3 times. The lights are paired with the signal to quiet down or remain silent, so the students are aware to be quiet. This theory can be applied to classroom management to improve increased participation, a positive learning environment, establishing routines, and managing behavior. Using consistency and routine reduces anxiety, provides a calm learning environment, and gives students a safe place to engage with other students in a predictable classroom environment. We then go on to talk about acquisition, which is the process of pairing a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus to produce a conditioned response. In the initial learning period, acquisition describes when an organism learns to connect a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. In psychology, extinction refers to the gradual weakening of a conditioned response by breaking the association between the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli. The weakening of a conditioned response occurs when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. For example, when the bell repeatedly rang and no food was presented to the dogs, Pavlov's dogs gradually stopped salivating at the sound of the bell. This theory is significant because it clarifies how associations shape behavior. Classical conditioning also provides valuable insights into learning processes that extend beyond experimental settings. This theory illustrates that repeated experience can alter responses and can be used in behavior modification, habit formation, and therapeutic interventions. Pavlov's findings have informed practical strategies in both education and clinical practice. Understanding its importance lays the foundation for exploring its historical origins. In conclusion, classical conditioning, sometimes called Pavlovian or respondent conditioning, is a form of associative learning that modifies behavior. It does this by creating associations between 2 stimuli and thus developing new stimulus-response connections. A neutral stimulus, which formally elicits no automatic response, is paired with an unconditional stimulus in order to establish a new conditioned response. Thank you very much.